welcome. Thank you for coming. This is actually a fourth public event within this series that that as a Ministry of Space, our collective organizes. It's called Towards a Different City. And we have a really a great pleasure and unique situation to have actually our friends and colleagues from different cities in different contexts together with us this night, live, in a physical space. This is actually thanks to the project that the Ministry of Space is a part of. It's called CMMM, or Critical Mapping of Municipalist Movements. It's actually implemented by the K-Lab from the TU Berlin, and it actually involves 3 cities, so Belgrade, Berlin, and Barcelona, and activists from these Belgrade, activist collectives. So actually what we are doing is we are mapping housing, we are discussing also our different situations. So this is actually a very unique opportunity to share this with the Belgrade residents or people and activists, and also to actually talk among ourselves. And this is actually really envisioned as a very informal talk, and we invite all of you, because in the audience, I mean, this is not all of us, so there are many of the CMMM participants in the audience, and obviously many of you from Belgrade. So we welcome you to jump in any moment to share whatever perspective or comment you have. So at the beginning, we'll go and, sorry, I forgot to introduce the participants. So we have Irene, let me say, Escortuela, okay, it's near, from Barcelona, from the Observatory Desk, and also she's a director of the Observatory Desk for economic, social, and cultural rights, but also she is one of the co-founders of the Tenants Union that was founded of Barcelona and Catalonia, that was founded in 2017. Then we have Julian Zwieker from Berlin. Julian is a political activist and also a consultant in many of the projects that consider urban democracy and this socially responsible governance of spaces and of real estate. So he will be representing Berlin. Then we have Ana Jokic from Who Builds the City, and from the Housing Equality Movement from Belgrade. Ana is a perennial activist, housing activist. Now mainly focused on the cooperative housing, but actually she was tackling much broader housing issues in the last 20 years. And then we have Marko and me, Jovana, from the Ministry of Space, who will be trying to moderate this discussion today. So the first round of discussion should be just to get to know the different contexts that we are in, and the different, maybe to just address, although we don't have enough time to go into depth, but maybe to address something that is currently like a specific topic within the housing sector or housing situation that would be in your city like the most critical or the most urgent matter. So maybe we can start with Irene.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to be here. And also there are my colleagues from Barcelona who actually are every day in the housing social movements, who can also explain many things after me. Well, in Barcelona, we were talking before, the main problem nowadays are evictions, actually. I mean, I think it's similar to here. We have most part of the housing stock owned by private owners. We only have 1.5% of public housing, so it makes very difficult to get to have a place to live, actually. We have like 10 evictions per day in Barcelona, in the city, yes. And it's been like the last 10, 12 years have been very, very difficult after the mortgage crisis, the housing crisis we had in 2008. We have had like 600,000 evictions in Spain, more or less, more than 600,000 evictions since then. So we firstly had a mortgage crisis with a lot of foreclosures. Loads of people were evicted at that point, 2008, 2010. And after that, the situation has changed. For example, 2013, we started to see some changes in that, and we started to see that most part of the evictions used to be because people could not pay their mortgage, but it started to change, and we saw that most part of evictions were because people could not pay their rent anymore. And nowadays, for example, in Barcelona city, I think it's 86% of the evictions are because of rent, not because of mortgage anymore. So it started to change. We also say that this change didn't come alone. It was because there were several laws that were passed in the country that made this happen. Laws that make it easier to evict, laws that were against occupations, squatting. In Spain, we have a lot of squatting, but not as a political movement, but poor people, poor families that cannot pay the market price for a house, so they just break into a house. We had loads of empty housing from banks. At the beginning, it was like the main fight from, for example, LAPA, the platform Anti-Evictions, which was born in 2009. The main fight was against the banks, the big banks, and it was easy because you could see an enemy. But then it started to change. And now it has evolved, and we have different actors. We had, last week, we had a session identifying more or less like investment funds and all these international investors that, I mean, there are everywhere nowadays, and that they own most part of the housing in Spain now. So yes, there has been this change. The rent was so detached from the salaries that people, I mean, they cannot pay the rent anymore. And yes, we had those laws passed some years ago, 2013 more or less, and the situation started to change. This financialization of rent too, and new movements were born. I think we will talk about that later. But yeah, and the situation is still more or less the same. We have had different policies, some laws trying to address the situation the last years, but still today, nowadays, we have so many evictions in the city and in the whole country. It is a huge problem, the biggest problem in Barcelona, we would say.
Thank you, Renem. Thank you. I mean, for now, but then we'll talk and maybe ask some like questions about cross-section.
Sure.
Thank you.
I will spoil a bit the Belgrade presentation when saying that, like, for us here, the most difficult thing is actually to bring housing as an issue in the mainstream. But last year, when the now famous referendum in Berlin happened, like, you know, we had these, like, you know, headlines in the newspaper saying how communism is coming back and like it's landing in Berlin, and like, you know, the housing is going to be nationalized or like expropriated. So it really like it was a kind of like, you know, a rare occasion where like the news on housing even comes to the front pages of Serbian newspaper. Not front pages, I'm over stressing, but it is the news. So yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to hear I understand the referendum has not been implemented, but what's the state of the affairs in housing in Berlin?
Yeah, maybe will not be implemented within the next 4 years, but we'll see that. So at the moment, the situation is not really optimistic or positive. Berlin is a city of renters, 85% rent, people who live in Berlin. So they live for rent. So they are dependent on land ownership and how apartments are being rent out. So this whole topic of housing has a famous history in Berlin. There have been protests around squatting houses in the 80s and 90s. A huge housing stock of public housing was sold in the 2000s. And now Berlin is actually trying to kind of catch up and buy the housing stock back, or tries to, and at the same time tries to introduce regulations on renting and the high level of rents. So by privatizing the housing sector, we actually, like everywhere, ran into the problem of prices, prices for land, since it's a limited resource, raise and raise and raise. We all know that problem with private investments, and at the same time, rents raise as well, but salaries kind of stay at a certain level or don't increase as fast as rents. So we have the problem at the moment in Berlin that we don't have enough space for the people who come to Berlin, who live in Berlin. We don't have enough space for cultural life, for social or public interest measurements and activities, and we're kind of trying to get back some control. Still, the image is a little bit different, and maybe in your perspective positive, when we're talking about land owned or managed by the state. So in our situation, it's still also the majority in private hands, but we have about 10–12% public housing, and there's a policy of increasing that up to 20%. So you could actually say the referendum is perfect, or fits perfectly in that policy actually, of increasing public housing, but still the topic of expropriating and taking back the housing stock from a private sector kind of raises a lot of conflict and a lot of fear that communism is coming back. It's actually funny that communism is coming back from the West and not from the East in that case. But communism is not coming back, so the current government in Berlin kind of hesitates to fulfill the ideas and the plans brought up by the referendum, which is quite a big majority in the referendum. 60% of the voters voted yes for the expropriation. But now they're discussing if it's actually legal to expropriate big housing companies. The talk is about up to 100,000 housing units that could be expropriated. The goal is that all of the companies who hold more than 3,000 housing units should be expropriated. But that's a discussion being held. At the same time, we try to introduce a rent cap, so limit the rent at a certain level so people with less income can afford rent actually. That didn't work out because the federal law said, okay, that's not in line with our laws being in power. So that is away again. And also other instruments to kind of influence the housing market, like preemptive buying, is kind of losing power through court decisions. So we're actually facing a situation where we have to make legal amendments and actually get back the instruments to kind of increase the control on the housing market. But there are yeah, a lot of obstacles to it, to actually implement a new social housing strategy, I would say.
Thank you, Julian. I mean, yeah, just for now, but maybe later we'll be going maybe deeper into these particular instruments that you mentioned, like preemptive buying or even the rent cap. Anna, you are actually, I forgot to mention that in the introduction, but you are actually active in two parallel contexts and two initiatives. One is based in Belgrade, but the other one is Stad de Mak in Rotterdam. So maybe if you want, you can also give, like, first of all, the situation in Belgrade, but also or in Serbia, and but also if you want and maybe think it's relevant or it's an interesting comparative, you can also give us the insight into the Rotterdam situation.
Okay, thanks. It could be a lot. I will try. I will see. Yes, I mean, I will connect to this what Marko was saying. So indeed the main problem here is that housing is not in the picture of public discussion and public policy. And the situation that we have here is that we live now for quite a long time without any housing strategy. There is no any housing policy. There have been made some strategies, like for instance, City of Belgrade has prepared a draft housing policy 3 years ago, which is sitting somewhere in the drawers without implementation. The national housing strategy has been made in the beginning of this year, but has been withdrawn from the procedure after 5 years delay in preparing it. So literally there are 2 people in public institutions that are dealing with housing, and no interest of political parties or those who are in power in these subjects. And all of that, actually, what is the result of all of that is that the housing is entirely left to the market, and these market forces are then shaping the reality of housing here. To the point that today we have quite a booming construction and real estate production in the city, and only, according to some estimations, only 5% of the population is buying this. So basically 95% is not even attempting to buy, and 5% is buying all this what is produced, which really is an extreme situation, which really points to the fact that housing is unaffordable to huge majority of people. And again, according to statistics which are produced by, or let's say, no statistics are not produced, but the illustration of the statistics produced by the public institutions is that about 80 to 90% of people cannot even afford a mortgage to buy. And why buying is important? Because only 1.5, or actually Barcelona was 1.5. Here, 1% of housing is social housing or any form of public housing. So all the rest is privately owned, out of which about 83% is inhabited by people who own, and then the rest is rental. And this rental is then very scattered rental, so there are no big companies which are renting, but is individuals, or by now also some individuals who bought a number of apartments, but this is not for sure in hundreds and thousands, but might be that they have 10, 15 or 20 apartments, but not like in hundreds. So the situation is very different from the two cities that we heard. There are some comparable things, but many other are quite different. And this diversification of forms of housing is definitely something that we lack here. So the private ownership has let's say, this format of individual ownership. There is no collective private ownership. There is no cooperative housing, died out basically. The social housing is really produced only when there is mainly foreign money, foreign either donations or some kind of big European projects which finance production of public or social housing, and no on the initiative of our authorities. So this is in very short the situation here. And now, if I take a few minutes, maybe just to say about the Dutch situation or the Rotterdam situation, there, of course, there is social housing, which has been a Dutch tradition, very important. But what happened in the last 30 years is that the percentage of social housing and privately owned completely turned around. So what was once before 30% private and 17% public or social, because it was not actually never really public, now swapped. So now it's 70% private and about 30% social housing. And this transition, which here happened very quickly, because in the 90s we had this very sudden switch where from societally owned or publicly owned, which was a bit different than publicly owned, but societally owned apartments who were sold to people that lived in them, we suddenly got to this super ownership state. The Dutch situation is reaching something similar, but in a very slow mechanism of selling the social housing stock and turning it into private. For that, there are different mechanisms. They sometimes go, let's say, in advantage of people who live in the apartments, but mainly actually not. And also social housing ends up on this real estate market in a big batches, similar to the situation in Berlin. So even the Dutch state really advocates for selling the social housing on real estate fairs and stuff like that. So that is in short.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe we could also immediately take, maybe if you have some comments, I mean, not wait till we talk about everything and then open it for discussion, but really open it right now if you want to add some specific questions or comments or bring some other perspectives as well.
I would like to hear from Irene, just hear from Irene about a bit about the context, because we all know that Ada Colau, the mayor of Barcelona, is a former housing activist. Did it brought any kind of change to the housing sector in Barcelona? If not, why? If yes, how? It would be great to share these things. Thanks.
Shall I answer?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it is a tough question. It doesn't have an easy answer, but I would say that the housing situation is so difficult in Spain that all the promises made in elections are impossible to got. So, for example, 0 evictions in the Barcelona city is impossible. We still nowadays have loads of evictions, even if Ada Colau is the mayor of Barcelona. That said, it is true that we can say that the investment in housing policies, in social policies, but especially in housing policies, is much bigger than before. The plan they made, a 10-year plan, was very good, and they have been implementing many of the things they promised. But the situation is still difficult. So, for example, nowadays we have the, how do you call the MPs, the representative, the people that used to be in the social movements, but now are part of the city council. They tweet, for example, hey people, today we have an eviction, we need help to stop it. And okay, there are the city council's efforts to stop the evictions within the institutional means, but there are also, you can find like tens of people at the door to stop the eviction. And this is a bit controversial because there are some people that say, why are they doing, like, they are not a social movement anymore. Why are they doing this kind of tweets? But on the other side, you can say, okay, they are joining efforts from inside and outside to stop evictions. Also, they created a new unit against evictions, which is quite well-funded and have very good people, with several ways of actions, more legal, for example, but also they created like some people specialized in, well, they would do what the social movements do, which is call to the bank or the landlord that is about to evict, try to mediate, find a relocation for the person if finally she is evicted or he is evicted. They even go to the door when the eviction takes place. So they had created a new unit which is powerful, but as I say, we still have a lot of evictions in Barcelona. And then it is true that they are building much more public housing, but it takes time. They have made an important effort in cooperative housing as well. So the cooperative movement is now much more powerful than it used to be before, thanks to this promotion from the city council. So no, there are many innovative policies. Sorry for this. From the city council, you can say that, but still the situation is quite hard. And also, I have to say, last thing. The social movements after that, because we thought that they would be weakened. I mean, weaker because many people left the movement and went to the city council. But today we can say that it is stronger. Even, I mean, more and more people. There are more activists for the right to housing in Barcelona nowadays. And maybe my colleagues can explain a little bit now or later, or I don't know, their vision about that.
Well, Ramallah won the elections just when the rental prices started to shoot up. So
Yeah.
she came in with a lot of promises to fix the situation, but the political economy of the market was like a tidal wave that they hadn't really prepared for. So I think that's an important issue, and also a question of competences. For example, in Catalonia, we passed September 2020, we passed a rent control law, and a couple of months ago, the Spanish Constitutional Court cancelled it. So these are things that have to be done at a supra-municipal level, and that the political relation of forces at the level of the Spanish state is much more unfavorable than in the Catalan and the municipal level. So I think that's also, but at the same time, you know, Barcelona is a pretty rich city for our context, and we have a situation of people in emergency housing situations that the municipality is paying, you know, pensions and things like this on a structural basis. And I think that, I don't know, for me that's difficult to explain, regardless of the competencies and stuff. I don't know.
No, and the importance of the time, you know, in political the tempos are very slow and very difficult to make the law, and the time, the tempo in of the society is the emergency of the evictor of tomorrow. And this is the change of people in the movements. Some people just passed, but a lot of people empower themselves, and it's very important people. And also the explosion of the social movements in Barcelona. One of the starts was the platform of people affected by mortgage. Now it's affected by housing. And now more than 20, no? More than 20 movements of a neighborhood movement of housing. And there's these two kind of fights.
Was there somebody else?
Oh, was it? No, sorry. No, I said it in Serbian. Iskra?
Whatever happened to is it working? Right. Whatever happened to these suggestions, legislative drafts that were brought by Podemos and PSOE in October 2021 about concerning rent caps and some investment in social housing, and also there were some, I think, drafts about helping young people who couldn't afford housing.
What happened to the Spanish law?
To the draft law.
The draft law. Yeah, yeah, we have a competences issue, and yes, we passed a rent control law in Catalonia because the movement is stronger in there than in other parts of the country, and yeah, and finally the Spanish court cancelled, ruled against this law. Also, this constitutional court ruled against anti-evictions law that we made with social movements in the Parliament of Catalonia. And now, okay, we thought, okay, maybe the solution is a Spanish law, because if they are ruling that we cannot do this in a region, let's do this in the central government. But the competences, it's true that our housing competencies are for regions. So now we have this draft law. Several social movements are together, and they did a platform, and well, and they said it's not enough, this law, the law that is going to be passed, but now it's in discussion in the Congress, in the Assembly, in the National Assembly, and they are discussing the amendments, or they have to discuss them. So it's still in the procedure in the General Assembly. So we don't know what's going to happen.
Can I jump in just to maybe continue on this, because it's a good question of relation, politics. I mean, having housing policy is like a really long-term policy because it takes a long time to really make some structural changes. So in what, maybe for Julian and Anna to also comment on, how do these do the political changes, like on a political party in power, to what extent do they influence the housing policy? I mean, is there continuity, because we do live in capitalism, unfortunately, whoever is in power, or do you feel some structural changes depending on who is in the power? And also, Julian, I think, Julian, I think especially relevant question is this kind of competencies on different levels for Berlin, at least, which you were talking about, which is what is the possibility or power of the local level, and then the municipal level, and then the state level.
Yeah, that's also a big question of the subsidiary system in Berlin, that we have federal level, and then we have state level, and then municipal level. I would like to say something else first, especially when we look at the housing market or at the real estate market, which lies underneath. We can have, on one hand, political measurements that kind of go in there and fight the present situation with regulations, with rent caps, with whatever, and some of them kind of work, some of them don't, and it's always very hard and takes long to find compromises and stuff. So that's maybe the strategy that Berlin is trying, but not really progressively, I would say. So there was a change over the last years, maybe even more when you look at the last decades. There was definitely a change in, okay, we have to kind of get back a relevant housing stock to actually influence, to have power, to have influence on the market. And there is also the realization that we need more social housing to actually be capable of the society and its needs. But then, and that's what I think is on the other side, if we don't want to wait for those political measurements that are taking long and that are often not really fitting, we actually have to do it ourselves, right? So we have to, we need actually players, we need companies, we need organizations, we need self-organization and empowerment to actually gain power ourselves and kind of build up a counterpart to politics. And I think we also have those players and organizations in Berlin, but the prices are too high to actually be able to buy real estate, for instance. I mean, there would be money actually, but it's still kind of going somewhere else. It's still going like the capitalistic, conventional way. And to change that is actually, again, something of politics and of political programs to actually fund the right companies and therefore like make their housing stock bigger, for example. So what's the problem in Berlin at certain levels is that we actually have instruments to influence the market, like I was talking before about the preemptive buying right, where municipalities actually have the right to go into a purchase and bring an alternative buyer into the purchase. So the municipality can say under restrictions that the original buyer has to leave the contract and the alternative buyer is kind of put into the contract. But you need those alternative buyers, right? So you need kind of socially oriented or publicly owned companies that kind of go in there. And now here we have a problem at the moment, meaning that there's kind of a loophole in this law, which gives the municipalities the right of first refusal of preemptive buying. And this can only be changed on federal level. And now we have municipalities not having any influence anymore because this instrument kind of got lost. And we have to kind of shift the social movement and its goals kind of to the federal level in 1 second to actually have a change on that legal level, and that's very complicated, and you can't really. That's an obstacle where we don't really come further at the moment.
And maybe this is also a good introduction to the work of who builds the city locally in terms of developing alternative housing developers. And not only in Serbia, but also in the region with the MOBA housing cooperative.
Yes. But maybe I was just thinking, what would I respond to Jovana's question? And I mean, I mentioned that there is a lack of housing strategy because I was thinking of these different decision levels. So what we have is a housing law which has been made or changed in the end of 2016. So it's now almost 6 years that we are supposed to implement this law. And what is really indicative is that the most discussed and used, let's say, part of this law is related to maintenance of collectively owned buildings, which is private owners. Imagine, like you probably saw New Belgrade, so one apartment building, how they organize and how they are forced actually to organize through different mechanisms to maintain these buildings. There was introduced this institute of let's say, a manager of a building, which can be volunteer, but also like a professional manager of the buildings, which then was the incentive that it would create new jobs, better management of the buildings and stuff like that. But it's really indicative that that has been the most important part of this housing law. All the rest before it and after it in this law has been left out of use. And one of the actually large segments of this housing law is related to social or not-for-profit housing, which is then given, there is a space given to public agencies and non-for-profit, non-governmental organizations to implement it. And so far we have one NGO that is registered, which is also part of our housing equality movement, housing center, that has been registered for this purpose of non-for-profit housing, but actually has never been approached by, I think, by any municipality or by the government here in Serbia, but yes, in Montenegro, for instance, to support their implementation of different let's say social housing or ways to come to social housing. And we recently, actually, it was very interesting for me, we were on a panel which was organized by colleagues from Montenegro, and it was interesting that they implemented this whole inclusive process of involving inhabitants in creating social housing, and not just in producing but also managing it. At the same time, we have here some of the social housing projects which have been implemented and then completely left to despair and dilapidation and destruction without any, let's say, guidance of the people who started to live in this housing with the prices which they cannot afford, and then the city of Belgrade, who has implemented, for instance, one of these projects, left completely these people, of which many now live without electricity in their apartments. So this is the context in which we are. And now, as I mentioned, in this law, there has been this, let's say, small, somewhere mentioned, that also other sorts of organizations can provide non-for-profit housing, which was somehow thing that we were also pushing together for to put in the law, but there is really no use of it until now. And in the, let's say that all of us who are acting here in the housing movement are basically acting not thanks to the support of the law, but despite the law and regulations, and are trying to push in some practices which would maybe point to possibility of opening doors for this. And with Who Builds the City, we started, now it's almost 10 years ago, with the idea to create a possibility for what was at that point for us not clear that it would become a cooperative housing, but for collective organizing in order to come to affordable housing made by the people who would live there. And meanwhile, cooperative form became somehow clear that this is not just something that is, let's say, on one hand has historical background here, but is completely forgotten in some way, or it was twisted because of the financial regulations, which didn't allow cooperatives anymore to function according to cooperative principles, but they were pushed basically to act on the market like any developer, and with that lost sense of meaning. And on the other hand, the need to create something new. So what has happened meanwhile is that we have developed a whole, or not whole, but big parts of a model how this cooperative housing could function here. And we started since last year to work with 2 groups that are interested to implement this. We are, I can say, at early stages still of this, but there is a hope, let's say, that we could in some foreseeable future have 2 pilot projects up and running that would point potential of this. And now what is interesting is that in the beginning, when we were starting to think about this, we were thinking that main, let's say, group that would participate in this process are younger people who don't have their own apartments, which is still focus. But what became clear meanwhile that there is older generation, which is also looking for something else. And this was not on our radar somehow. And what became interesting that we were approached by a group of seniors, and actually mainly women, who were asking us to support them in the process of creating, for them was not clear that it should be cooperative, but some sort of collective way of organizing in order to provide both for unsustainability of living alone and paying all the expenses. On the other hand, lack of care in which you can participate and be active contributor and not just be served by someone, but also contribute. and also loneliness, which many older people here live quite lonely because we have also quite a big number of younger generations left to live abroad, and then these parents stayed here without basically any close relatives. So this situation is now, luckily, I would say, pushing some of them to think about how you could unite and how you could move forward together. And now it's really interesting that how to connect these different generations into thinking together about this cooperative housing. And what Marko was mentioning, we are trying to build slowly from bottom up, because there is no really any support from top to build an ecosystem also here locally, but also regionally, because we realize that we have no sparring partners here with the government, with municipality, not with financial institutions, also with banks. So we started to build this regional movement, which meanwhile became also registered as a European Cooperative Society, which is a special form which exists on the level of European Union. It's called MOBA. And MOBA Housing European Cooperative Society is actually creating these conditions, on one hand building peer support between now the cities that are part of it are Budapest, Prague, Ljubljana, Zagreb, and Belgrade. And another thing is that we are building a common, let's say, standard, let's say, of projects which are all non-for-profit, collectively owned, but then with some slight variations. And the aim of all of this is basically to create a possible on one hand, entity that can negotiate with bigger partners outside of our small local context. And for instance, today our colleagues are in Barcelona on FEBEA, which is a FEBEA conference, annual conference. And FEBEA is a Federation of Ethical and Alternative Banks to negotiate about ways of financing this sort of cooperative housing here in the wider region. So that's in brief.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. Okay, so if anybody has a question or a comment at this point, yeah, please.
Hi, so I have a question for Julian and also Irene, if she wants to answer too. Can you explain how social movements and political parties in Berlin and also in Barcelona brought, in Berlin's case, the referendum issue or in generally housing issue to the public eye? From your perspective, maybe you can tell us from your perspective the chronology or key moments or battles that led to the moment of, let's say, referendum. Or in other words, how did you made, or not just you, but the social movements made the average citizen or voter feel that that affordable housing is his right. That's I think maybe a key differential between Berlin and Belgrade, even though we lived in a former socialist country. Here, people just, even though they are struggling, perhaps or for sure more than people in Berlin or Barcelona, they just don't even question that market is the only solution to this problem. And the other question was, can you also talk about concrete social housing policies or maybe some of the better practices?
Thank you for stealing the rest of our questions.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask a question also on this topic of ownership, because I think that's a huge difference in our cities when you look actually on who owns the real estate or the land, and what to do about those people, you know, how to get connection, how to convince them to do something else than making a profit out of it, right? But to answer the questions you had, I think the referendum kind of built upon a long history of protesting and suffering of tenants from market-oriented management of housing. So there were big protests before by tenants who claimed the management of big housing companies. So you could say they actually hurt themselves, the companies, by bad behavior. So you could actually claim for an alternative solution to it. So what was complicated, I think, for the referendum to actually put the topic of expropriating on the table again, because we have a rather complicated history or very bad history of expropriating in the Second World War, in the Soviet Union, where people got expropriated. So it was, I think, hard to come up with that term again. But since at that time the referendum kind of started, I would say 1 or 2 years ago, like really to push in communication. They had a really good communication and also campaigning and community organizing. So they were organized in like very small structures in all parts of the town to actually talk to people and get in touch and kind of emotionally catch the people on the street. What they actually did in a moment where housing was already a very urgent topic, you know, so you could talk to anybody and they would know that there's a problem around housing. And they actually talked about the referendum as one new solution to the problem, which is kind of emerging throughout years. And it was quite an easy solution, I would say. So it was not a complicated plan or a complicated strategy or something, but it was just, hey, those companies are too big, let's just take the housing stock back. And you could also connect it to history, because this housing stock was sold to those companies 20 years before, right? So you could just argue, hey, we're just getting back what was actually publicly owned. I would say those were like a few arguments, just to name a few, that the referendum was arguing with. Again, they did a really good job on communicating, I would say, which is not really common in this activist scene of Berlin or maybe Germany as a whole. Like initiatives just don't have the resources to have like good communication campaigning. That's actually something we're learning over the last years, to actually be able to make things more simple or communicate them more simple than they maybe are, or than we maybe think about them. So this is one part. And social housing strategy, well, that could take long, but maybe just to name one, there's a cooperation agreement between the state of Berlin and the state-owned housing companies, which are private entities, but 100% of the shares belong to the state. And there's a cooperation agreement which says rents can only be raised 2% per year or something. And the average or the maximum raise on the private sector is 15% every 3 years, so 5% per year. That's, for example, one measurement. Then they have regulations on mediating between tenants and housing company if there's debts or if something there's a problem in the renting relation between the tenant and the company, such things. There are also regulations on participatory rights of tenants in those companies, but that's more formal. Like we have assemblies or the possibility of assemblies, tenants assemblies in public housing stocks, but they are not really effective or not really working that well because actually the companies don't really want that. It was just a regulation the policy was kind of putting upon them.
I have a short follow-up question on that, or you want?
But you want for Julian,
Yeah, just for the question of the social movements, I would say that one of the most joyful things that I heard tonight, and the housing comparisons are not usually joyful, is the fact that in Barcelona, contrary to the fears, the number of housing activists increased since 2015. I'm curious, like, how did this, like the federal court stopping the rent cap and like, the new Berlin coalition not following up on the referendum, how did this affect all the housing movement? Like, has there been an anger and like increase of involvement, or there has been an apathy, what we would expect here?
I would actually say there was more disappointment than like an increase of energy, sadly. So maybe it kind of pushed this referendum on expropriation. That could be, that people said, okay, now the rent cap didn't happen. The preemptive buying right decision was after that, but that could like maybe push a little bit more yes into this referendum, at least in Berlin. But I would say there was more disappointment than increase of movement.
Yeah, like key battles from the social movements. I have to start after the housing crisis in 2008 with this wave of evictions we had first with the mortgage movement, the mortgage crisis and this anti-eviction movement, the platform, the PA, that was born in 2009. And that was how the housing issue went into the agenda. Basically because we started a draft law from the PA, the Observatory Desk, and unions and other movements to the Spanish central government to implement some housing policies, to pass a law on housing, which was not passed finally, but we went on TV and we were for months in the street collecting signatures. And I think it helped people to understand why some people were moving around the mortgage crisis and understand that people were losing their homes and that was not fair. And I would say that was how this housing movement started. And from then on, it was engaging more and more people in the streets, basically. And the assemblies were were bigger and bigger, and then it spread to, I don't know how many, over 200 cities in Spain. 70 in Catalonia. So it became a very big, also the Indignados movement, the Occupy movement in 2011 helped to make this movement bigger as well. So yeah, the housing was in the agenda, and it was thanks to this difficult situation because people were losing their homes. And then, as I was saying, the tenants movement started to be more important. In Barcelona now, we are around 40% of rental, of renters. 40. No, 40. Yeah, 40. Because if you see the overall in Spain, it's 15%, I think, because the rural areas don't have so many, well, as everywhere. But in Barcelona, the rental movement is stronger. So that's when we thought, okay, we were seeing other cities with tenants movements, and in Spain we didn't have. The tenants were not organized, and we had this first meeting to create the tenants union. And now there are several other tenants unions in other cities, but also in several neighborhoods. Like there are so many housing movements around. And yes, we had this, I had to say that in 2015 we tried to pass another law, like the first one which brought the housing issue to the agenda was 2011, I think, 2012, and it did not pass, but the following one, which was to the Catalonia parliament, the Catalan parliament, it was passed. It was this anti-eviction law. It was successful, and it was it helped to stop a lot of evictions. And also it was challenged by the Constitutional Court, but it was a great victory. So the movement, I think that it helped the movement to become even bigger, because when you have this kind of victories and you feel like you have passed a law, it was a very good moment. And then, yeah, with the tenants movement, we had this feeling that everyone had this problem. It was, I remember I went on the TV, and the person that was making up, she had the same, she could not pay the rent. And also journalists, it was the media were interested in this issue because they themselves, they had this problem, they had this housing problem. So yeah, we could pass this rent control law in Catalonia, which now is the Constitutional Court ruled against. And now we have this Spanish law, which is apparently is taking the rent control to the whole state. But we'll see how it works, because it's not the same ruling as in Catalonia, and we'll see. We think it's weaker, but it can work if it's passed. And regarding the social housing, I have to say that we always have a debate, because when we talk to the private sector, for example, they always say, okay, I don't know why you want this rent control law, or you're always against the landlords, because what we need is more social housing. The problem is that we don't have social housing in Spain. Now, okay, I agree with you. Like, that's true, we don't have social housing, and the administration has to make an effort to have more, but also we can't forget that if meanwhile the 98% of the housing stock is in the private market, we have to regulate it, and we need laws to regulate it. So, I mean, it's important, it's very important social housing, but also it's important to regulate the market. And regarding policies around social housing, we had, I mean, I think the only solution is investment, a lot of money, put a lot of money and build a lot. Or in Barcelona, we don't have many space to build up, but there are many new developments. I think they asked for a credit from the European Bank of Investment, and now they are trying to find some private-public ways to fund it, because it's very expensive. I don't know if it is the solution, but it is. That's what's happening in the city now. And then, as I said before, they have promoted a lot of the cooperativist movement on housing, which is, the movement was still there, but they have helped it to bloom. And also they are promoting this kind of emergency housing. It's with containers from ships. And it's not so fast, it's not so cheap, but at least it's easier than the normal housing development. And they are doing this in several neighborhoods, so that you can use empty spaces or spaces that are public, but for example, in some years there will be a school, and meanwhile you build up this housing, these blocks, and they are really cool. I mean, when you see the containers, being put there, you think it's ugly, but then when you see the housing, it's really cool. Maybe it's not for, I don't know, the life of that is like 80 years. I don't know. It's not like concrete, but it's a solution for emergency situations. But as I say, it's not so fast. But they are doing this in several empty spaces in the city. That's it. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, sorry.
So, hi, my name is Ali. I lived in Hamburg for 4 or 5 months in 2009, 2010. And I know Berlin a little bit, but not that much, just 1 month spent there. But what I know is that it's easier to find a job than a house or a flat to live in, right? And what I also know is that people complain about this process of interviewing. Like, they need to go through a lengthy interviewing process, and I find it a little bit humiliating, especially what foreigners have to go through. And I don't know if there is anything to improve this process. What can be done? I mean, from your perspective, maybe your first-hand story to tell us, I think.
Well, that's a broad thing, I would say. Suddenly I hear myself in the room. That's a lot of topics, I would say, right? So I would say that touches topics of race and how we think about race and how we are being racist in society. I would say this is one topic, and also kind of judging for social economic situation, which I think in Berlin is a huge problem. So the more income you have, the more likely you're gonna get the apartment, because it's more security for the landowner. But in the end, I would say we just, at least in Berlin, we need more housing, more space for housing, more affordable housing. So I can remember the times I moved to Berlin, that was in 2011. And it was actually right in the middle or in the beginning of the crisis, I would say, or the emerging problem. But back then, you could still kind of find an apartment and just go somewhere and be there without 500 people around you when you visit an apartment that is being rented out. So that already changes the whole outcome of it. It doesn't change the origin of the bad behavior connected to other problems in society, I would say. But we definitely need more space. I mean, the Berlin Senate says they're going to build 20,000 housing units per year now. Nobody really believes that this is going to happen. I think the state-owned companies built 70,000 units within the last over 10 years, I think. So that doesn't really fit. Let's see how they're gonna manage it. I actually don't know. And that's where I think this topic, maybe saying it again, of how to connect to the people who actually own land. How do we actually solve this? I'm just right into a project which concentrates on that, on real estate mediation, trying to connect actually to a relevant part of housing owners. It's about 15% of housing units in Berlin. We have 2 million in total that are actually private persons. And who we actually want to connect to sell their houses to cooperatives and to the social-friendly sector of the housing market. And that's actually a strategy which was not really implemented or explored in the past. And I'm excited how it's going to work. And when I think about Belgrade, when you talk about most of the land and most of the housing is owned by private persons, who are those people? How can you connect to them to maybe somewhere in the future actually get their real estate, get their apartments, to organize them for a better meaning or a social meaning?
Do you want to respond? No. Okay, I just wanted to jump in. I mean, it's maybe a little bit late. It was more related to the previous question. But I think it was in the very question that you posed for Belgrade, for Serbia as well, this question of, like on the one hand, wider public understanding or feeling, you know, on their skin or in their everyday lives, the very, like the material reality of this unaffordability of housing. But then on the other hand, not really willing, or at least not by now, not willing to mobilize like in a wider sense. And the Ministry of Space was doing like 2 months ago or 3 months ago a kind of study on the Belgrade level about housing statuses, about the perception, the subjective perception of people towards housing conditions and some of the housing measures. And yeah, and it was very obvious. I mean, it was like super obvious that they recognized the problem of unaffordability. It was like undoubtable, like they do that. But then there is this huge distrust, and you also mentioned it, Julian, just now, towards the institutions and the state, that it can, first of all, it can do policies or bring policies in the public interest, and also to manage the housing and specifically the housing in a way so to serve the wider public and not just some particular interest. So this distrust is a huge problem here. And secondly, also this there was a significant support to the measures that we are all here promoting and advocating for. So, you know, from secure renting, more public housing, cooperatives. So there is actually a significant support, like wider support. But Anna mentioned the question of ownership or orientation towards the ownership as like security is still quite an obstacle because of all these like the non-speculative cooperative housing or the public housing. It's all oriented to the non-private ownership regime, whereas people see it still very understandable in the circumstances here in Serbia. They see it as a very unsecure matter. I mean, I just wanted to jump in just to, I think it illustrates very well the context and the perception that at least the housing movement and all the organizations that are in it are facing. Sorry for prioritizing. Yeah.
The other, I mean, if they don't trust that, what's their option? Buying, purchasing a home, right?
Or renting on market, yeah.
Or renting on the market.
But they all believe they will buy. Once.
In Spain as well, but after the housing crisis, you wouldn't have a mortgage as you did before, so you had to rent. That's why the renters increased and the situation changed. Not only because of that, but it was an important issue. Like they had to change the way they were selling mortgages, and now if you don't have some savings, you cannot access to the property market, let's say.
And I think it's not a solution actually to leave it private, because then in 20 years we have the same problem. The people are selling it again. So what we actually need is legal legal measurements to actually save the land, you know, and make it binding and make it not breakable and not sellable again. And I would say we have ideas and we have methods in Germany, for example, to do that, but there are only little chances to implement that, because it's still about buying the land and then securing it legally between different companies, for instance. You know, you have something like it's called Erbbaurecht. It's a special form of leasing land. Actually, there's a landowner, and you sign a contract over 90 years or more with a company who's actually managing the land and building upon it and managing the housing and stuff. But that's a legal instrument that you can trust on, where you don't have a state that could be shifted throughout a new government. And also, you don't have only one company who's private who could just change and sell it again, but you have different companies who are like within a legal framework and network that is actually binding. That could be one to think of, and then we have other models which are more complicated to explain now, but that also work with like different entities holding one real estate or one land together and being like reliable to each other, so it's kind of secured and can't be sold anymore.
That's interesting, because I was just yesterday finishing an article on this, because we are trying to imagine or to develop something like that here. There is but then again, legally, all sorts of possibilities have been cut, so you have to be very inventive how to make it happen. Like for instance, here legally, you cannot lease land, ownership of the land and the building cannot be separate. And only if you lease from the public land, then you can do that. But if it's in private hands, then you would have to have something like what you speak about, like connected companies or different kind of bodies that could do that.
Right, for the state, there's a different law, but then it's possible. You just have to transpose it to the private sector.
But it's not possible for the private sector for some reason. And another thing is that here land was until few years ago, actually, all land was in public ownership, and then the titles were transmitted to those that have buildings on this land, which was a really very unwise decision, because in all the cities where you want to have some kind of control over what is happening, you want to have the land ownership in your hands, and you have also income on a long term, and like this you basically, they basically gave up on this land for free in name of those that have titles on the buildings on top of them. So it's really very wrong decision. And another thing, then again, there is the taxation laws are prioritizing individual private ownership, and any form of collective ownership is taxed more. So there is no incentive actually for people to unite in order. So these things. By now, there is also understanding, for instance, within the Ministry of Construction, of this one person that I was mentioning, that something with taxation is really wrong for all these sort of things to change. So there is some kind of idea that we should talk about it at least, but that's the level where we are at the moment.
I forgot to say before when I was talking about public housing, because in Barcelona, as I said, we don't have many land left to build on. So we had this 30% measure, which is any new development or refurbishment, remodelation. Yeah, because it was happening a lot, some companies bought old buildings and they refurbish and then sell again for luxury flats or whatever. Any of this kind should have 30% of social housing. Not social housing, affordable housing. Like the price should be reduced, and it was for any private that would do this in over 600 square meters. So we thought that this would help to have affordable housing in the whole city, in all the neighborhoods. And the problem was that we could fix you could say that it would be affordable housing, but you could not say, okay, it has to be for rent, for example. It was also a fixed price to sell as well. And then we put the preemptive buying for the city council. So if they wanted to buy this 30% and make it public housing, they could. And it's not such a big policy, but it was there was a huge debate in the city against the developers, and it was terrible. Also, it went to into a trial. I mean, but we thought, okay, if we don't have land, why don't we just do this for the privates? Like 30%, it's compulsory to have affordable housing. And I have to say that at the beginning, what we did not put was a moratorium. Before. So all the licenses, all the developments that had to be done the next years were asked to do before this law was passed. So at the beginning, the newspapers were like, it is not working because nobody is asking for a building in Barcelona. And okay, hundreds of you asked that before, so that you could avoid that. And then the pandemic came, but they said that this would make the city to be less dynamic, to have less promotion, less developments in the city, which is not a problem actually, but yeah, there was a huge debate, and yeah, we said, okay, the private landlords, the promoters, the developers, they also have to do something for housing, so let's do that.
This brings me exactly to, it's a good example. Anna mentioned this forum in Montenegro that happened, and actually when we were there, some of us from the movement, we actually heard one interesting, for now, very potent and interesting, we'll see how it goes. It's a similar example from Tirana in Albania, that they, on a city level, since 3 years ago, they brought a law on a city level that 3% of construction surface of every privately invested housing has to be given to the city for to use it as affordable housing. So actually it has to be given without any kind of additional subsidies or any, so it's just that they're using this huge wave of private investment in it. And the similar thing, I mean, at least for these 3 years, the amount of houses built has not decreased. And actually the city has gained a significant number of publicly owned flats. There are different challenges. And I'm sorry, one of the crucial motivations was actually that they have equally or relatively equally distributed public housing throughout the city, and not the segregated social housing as we have, for example, in Belgrade, especially. So anyway, but there are different challenges now arising from that. But the fact is really that, it was something that they just imposed on private investors. They used this kind of influx of privately owned housing that was built, and just said, okay, this goes to the city, to public housing. So, I mean, it just sounds as a very interesting example. It's in the region. We'll hopefully try to bring someone from Tirana to talk a little bit more about it here, but just it reminded me what you said of that example, recent example. Anna?
Yeah, I just have to say that in Spain, Yeah, I have to say, yeah. In Spain, the law of the land says that there is, I don't remember now specifically the numbers, but it's a 15% of floor space has to be given to the public, plus another 15% the city can say what if they are used for protected, like affordable housing. What happened in Spain up till 2008, and there was like, you might remember that Spain was this place where it was building much more, you know, like more houses that Germany, France, and I don't know, Italy together, something like this. What happened is that the cities got this capacity of building, which is, well, long story, but it's like, it's not land, but it's square meters, whatever, and sold it to the market again to get money to do whatever they were doing. So I haven't run the numbers, but if the city, if any municipality in Spain, since that law will have kept that percentage to actually build public housing, now the situation will be a totally different one. So just to say like 3%, I think that you can push for more, probably. But it then comes also to what is the sense of what is the general perception of what you can do with that. And I think that one of the things that the PA did very successfully, and we might even see the effects now, is that it produces a narrative that links a common personal problem into a system. I mean, like, it really made people think what is going on here, and it gave an explanation, and, you know, like, which was very technical, of how all this cycle of investment, the banks, and the law was actually linked. So it was not only that you will think, oh, it's so bad that these poor people are evicted. By the way, most of the people, at least at the beginning, the PA, were migrants. So it was amazing that migrant, you know, people became a main actor. It was that it linked with something else that was happening. And I think that was, I wouldn't know what was, you know, exactly the tools, but I think that this was the thing that resonated, no? Like it unveiled a way of how this whole cycle of financialization and actually what people were seeing about the construction of their environments were linked with this precarity of the thing. And the second thing I have to say is that actually before a change done by the Socialist Party, actually rent contracts were for life in Spain. And before that, you could even do rent contracts for 3 generations. And after that change, it went back down to 7 first, I think, and then 5, and then 3. Yeah, so it started to decrease. So, but there was a moment where renting was not precarity, because you could rent for all your life for a price that was regulated. I mean, I could increase or not. So I think that there is like yeah, security can be seen in different ways.
Yeah. This was the case in Yugoslavia also. Any other last round of questions and comments before we
Get some air.
Get some air, but yeah, get all together and continue this maybe in a even more informal way. Yeah, Lorenzo. Yeah, just.
No, I think that we've talked a lot about policies and stuff, but really what really makes the whole wheel turn is the stopping the evictions, and the empowering effect that stopping an eviction has on people. Even if you're just postponing an eviction, the fact that you have in neighborhoods people coming together and being able to, you know, really fend off the police, the judicial system, just with their bodies, talking to each other, creating very, very strong connections there, and you do that weekly, and it's happening in every neighborhood. You're building up power, as you were saying, that then, you know, is channeled into, you know, a municipalist initiative or a popular legislative initiative, etc. But without that, I don't think that the social energy would allow for these kind of initiatives. So I don't know, maybe try to stop an eviction here in Belgrade, or
We didn't mention that,
Yeah.
but it's very important. One of the very important things that happened here, and yesterday was 5 years of our anti-eviction movement,
okay.
which is called Za krov nad glavom, or for a roof above one's head. And it has started from, let's say, some of the groups which are here getting together with other groups. And in the beginning, there were a couple of groups, but then it became really individuals who started to join this. And it is indeed very powerful, and all of us were very active in this, standing in the life wall to protect evictions. So yeah, that is really empowering and really important thing. And I think this anti-eviction movement and the idea of stopping evictions of people is something that by now I think everyone is aware of, or at least heard of. But I would have to say that it's much less people joining it than what we saw in Spain. It's really not that scale and yeah, I don't know. I guess that it is still somehow people now think, yes, it can happen to me as well, but don't feel it so much on their own skin. And I think that this is probably the reason why they are not there defending their own neighbors even. But people, let's say, activists are coming from all sorts parts of the city, but then the neighbor next door is like not interested in this, and that's really an issue.
I mean, it's an issue in Berlin as well, or has been. There's anti-eviction movement. But I also think it's not that big because it's just not happening on that scale. But I think it could become a problem because we have a huge problem, especially in Berlin and the biggest cities, of separating housing into housing units, right? So normally our houses are like one block of apartments, and there's one real estate. And like the last level of capitalization is to separate those, cut this house into pieces and sell the units themselves. It's like a price gap from like 3,000 euros to 5,000 euros a square meter or something. So, and then if there are private owners actually, so private persons, they can actually evict the people more easily because they can like claim for an own use, and there are also loopholes and stuff. So maybe that could become a problem, and I'm definitely taking with me maybe the foreseeing measurements or just the perspective to strengthen that movement, I would say. And I'm also taking from Belgrade, I think, your power to just continue and maintain your work, I think, because I think we will have hard times in Germany too, like COVID depending, money-wise, and so forth. And I'm definitely taking something back to Berlin.
Thank you. Add something for the end.
I think I mean, in Spain we have a very unprotective law for tenants, and in Berlin it's not like that. So that's why we have so many evictions, because now it's every 5 years or every 7 years, but before it used to be every 3 years you can evict. The contract is finished. So, and yeah, and the non-payment evictions, I mean, the law is different. It makes it much worse. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's been interesting to hear you and see how different movements work. Yeah, I think we learned a lot from Berlin, and at the beginning of the Tenants Movement, I remember we watched this documentary. I don't remember the name, but we went there. We asked how they worked, and we saw that if you have one block, one landlord, it's much easier to negotiate. And now, like, well, they can say better than me, but the efforts are to find other tenants or other people with you that have the same landlord, so that you can gather and be more powerful to fight the landlord. Otherwise, if your landlord is an individual, it's much more difficult. Also, the law, the anti-eviction law, is different for big landlords than for individuals. So yeah, having individuals, you would say, like here, you would say it's, well, it's not so speculative maybe, because they are normal people, they are not investment funds, they don't want the profit that much. But in the end, you realize that maybe what we usually say is that, for example, Blackstone leads, and they say they were key to increase the rents, the prices, but then the other individuals followed them. Like the market, the price market didn't rise because of only investment funds. Everyone wanted to have profit. So yeah, in the end, the landlords, these kind of landlords are evicting as well. So you have to see what kind of policy implement there. And of course, it's not the same, but I mean, no, it's tough because I mean, having this capillarity, this kind of a structure in the property, it's also tough. It's not. It's not. Yeah, it's challenging. It's not so.
Okay, thank you. So thank you. I mean, we definitely from here find inspiration in both Berlin and Barcelona and Zagreb. We're sorry that Iva Marčetić wasn't able to come today here as well. But yeah, we just keep on doing this however we can, and hopefully keep connecting among ourselves. So that could be useful for all of us. So thank you, Anna, Julian, and Irene. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming and being part of the discussion. So now we can just continue, if you want, talking a little bit here, but we can finish this semi-formal part. So thank you.